Ross Feingold is in Asia for us tonight. We'd like to catch up with Ross. He'll be a familiar face here, no doubt, on TalkTV, and a familiar voice on Talk Radio. Ross, hello there. Good morning.
Good morning from Taipei.
Thank you for being with us, Ross. Really appreciate it. Biden's first trip to Asia. How big a moment is it? Put this into context for us, Ross. How significant a trip is this for both both President Biden and the region?
Well, it's a great question because of all the recent U.S. presidents. We could go all the way back to Bill Clinton on forward, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now President Biden. We constantly hear this message. It's the Pacific century. It's the Asia century. And we're going to be there. Or we're going to be back. We're coming back because we weren't there before. We're pivoting. We're rebalancing. They keep coming up with different slogans, right? It was Asia. Now it's Indo-Pacific. We had a TPP, and then we weren't in it. Now we have an Indo-Pacific economic framework that Biden's announcing. So every president, every U.S. administration says we're really going to be active in the region, whether that's trade, security, or in other spheres. But then they always seem to have other issues that divert their attention, whether it was, we go back to George W. Bush, obviously 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama was also similarly busy with the war on terror. Trump, you could debate whether he was really invested in being in Asia or he had his America First priorities. And Biden, obviously, he's had to deal with COVID as well as the war in Ukraine, inflation. So for an administration that claims to say we're going to have great Asia policies, we're going to be involved in the region, my gosh, he took office in January 2021, and his first trip to Asia is in May 2022. Well, yeah, okay, there was COVID, but international travel has resumed. Maybe we could go back to just a few months ago, or last year, for example, the Tokyo Olympics. So we can't say that it was impossible for him to be in the region a little bit earlier. Or another way to look at this is the recent summit in Washington, D.C. at the White House with most of the ASEAN leaders. It was a big to-do. Another way that the Biden administration said, we want to demonstrate that we're heavily involved and invested in Southeast Asia. And then at the end of this event, the U.S. announces $150 million in new spending related to the ASEAN countries. Some of it is related to things like cultural relations. We're going to send more English teachers there. But of course, if you think about it, $150 million U.S. dollars spread across 10 ASEAN countries, one of them Indonesia with its very large, not just land, but population, you say, my gosh, this is just not a lot of money. And China comes along and says, we're going to fund some big infrastructure project like a railway or a highway. And it just brings up the same old issue. Compared to China, the approach is very different, and we could criticize China's approach. There's the issues that I'm sure your audience knows about, like the debt trap concerns. They use their own labor when they build infrastructure projects. But time and again, a lot of the leaders in the region, they still appreciate that, or they want to do business with China. And the struggle for the U.S. really is to get the Asian countries on board with U.S. policies towards China. And the countries in the region are willing to do that, but on their own terms and to the own extent. Yeah, sure, Korea, Japan, especially Korea with its new president, more on board. But the ASEAN countries, really, they're not there. They're not on board with that.
So how does Biden approach that then in terms of, I guess trying to sort of, I mean, he can sort of be a sort of a bridge builder, a go-between. Would he see his role as that as he heads to Asia this week?
Well, that's probably why they came up with this thing called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's not a trade agreement, so it doesn't come with the heavy lift, for lack of a better description, that a trade agreement would have. You have labor, you have environmental groups that are all going to have an opinion on a trade agreement. It's all but impossible to get it approved in U.S. Congress anyway at the moment, let alone the parliaments of participating countries. So instead of proposing a trade agreement something that might run into the roadblocks of a trade agreement, they come up with this framework. So your description, like a bridge, it fits that, right? The framework is basically, okay, people who have some shared values with us, whether that has to do with things like democracy or it has to do with things like standards for the internet, data security kind of issues, we'll work together with you. So there's this framework, and yeah, maybe that's how the Biden administration plans to be in this bridge role and deepen relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific region. But again, like I said a few minutes ago, the buy-in is going to vary considerably among different countries here in the region.
And we've just been considering how Joe Biden has a new Australian Prime Minister to deal with. An election, of course, in the last day, meaning that that's a new relationship to be built. How do you see that playing out, Ross? And they are better bedfellows, it's probably fair to say, isn't it?
I'm pretty sure that Team Biden at their hotel overnight Asia time, they were celebrating this. I mean, obviously, they prefer a political party that's more aligned to the U.S. Democratic Party, so a left of center, emphasis on climate change, social issues, whether that's LGBT or other social issues. Obviously, Australian Labor is a lot more aligned than the Australian Liberals, who were more aligned with the U.S. Republican Party. So, of course, they're not going to say so publicly, but there were probably high fives going around Team Biden while they're on their trip to Asia. So they're probably thrilled with this. So there will be a lot of or increased cooperation on things like climate change. The new leadership in Australia during the election campaign, they said that they're still on board with AUKUS. They're not going to look to cancel that. They're not going to go back to France and buy the French submarines, although the French were pretty happy that Morrison lost as well. They were also toasting that election result. But when it comes to the broader China issues, whether or not the new Australian government is going to be fully on board, that also remains to be seen. Again, they've said some things during the election campaign that indicates they also want to be tough on China. But there are a lot of security hawks in the United States or in Australia who do have real concerns about that, and whether or not the new government is going to look to resurrect some of the aspects of the trade relationship that have deteriorated in recent years.
And does Joe Biden have a role to play in bringing Asia into the war in Ukraine, or at least guiding perhaps Asia's response to the war in Ukraine? Will that feature on the agenda, and in what capacity?
Well, the easiest thing to do is get some joint statements, whether that's with Korea in the bilateral meetings or in Japan with the bilateral meetings or the multilateral meetings of the Quad. We deplore aggression. We support democracy. We support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. That's fairly easy to do. And you could get some money out of these countries as well, right? Japan. And to be fair, they've been generous, whether that's Japan, Korea, here in Taiwan government and the public have also donated tens of millions of dollars for humanitarian assistance. But you briefly mentioned India, and India has taken its own position on this. They didn't want to participate in the UN resolutions. They've continued to buy natural resources from Russia. So there's been some difficulty there. And it surprised some people in the sense that, India has its issues with China. India says it's part of the Quad and democracy versus authoritarianism. Personally, I was disappointed. We know that over the decades of its independence, India has maintained its own foreign policy. It's leader of the unaligned, non-aligned countries, but I thought this was a situation where India should have taken a more clear position. Maybe they'll come around. But when it comes to things like military assistance or transferring weapons, for example, that we see NATO countries doing, there'll be some challenges in getting any Asian country to do that.
Okay, while we have you, Ross, I also want to talk about North Korea, which is a part that I was saying before that it's not always easy to get reliable information from North Korea. But as we understand it, the COVID-19 outbreak continues to rumble on, but rumble on really significantly in that part of the world. Ross, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And they finally admitted it. I mean, nobody really believed that they had zero COVID throughout the last 2 years. There's even with UN sanctions. I mean, there's still some trade that goes on. Right, there is breaking of the sanctions. There is still a little bit of cross-border travel through the land border with China, or of course at sea as well. So the idea that they had no COVID is it's just very difficult to believe. But not only is it just nearly impossible to get accurate information, but it raises a really important point in trying to resolve this situation. Even if North Korea is willing to accept some foreign aid, and they've been reluctant to do so, but how do you get it in there? Now, how does a foreign government or an NGO that the North Koreans say, okay, you could come here, send us some doctors, send us some vaccines, send us some PPE. I mean, how do you put your people on an airplane to go in there? Because you have to consider the risks that would happen to your staff when you're on the ground. There's limited medical care there. It's such a heavy negotiation with the North Koreans to get in and to get out. Everything's got to be scripted out and planned, flight schedules and things like that. I mean, if you send your NGO staff, doctors or other type of staff in country, and then they get sick with COVID because there's this big outbreak there, then you have a huge problem for your staff. This is a very, very complex issue. And to their credit, the new government in South Korea has offered, that's such a weird position for them to be in their first days in office, because the President Yoon, he ran on being tougher on North Korea, a departure from former President Moon's attempts to befriend North Korea. And now he's suddenly saying, yeah, I'm willing to send you COVID aid. Logically, they are the people to go in, right? Not just because they speak the language, but they can just drive across the border, right? There is a road through the DMZ. That really is the most logical people to bring in COVID aid. Will the North accept it, or will they insist that it comes from elsewhere? It's a big unknown right now.
Yeah, and as you said, getting the reliable information in the first place. I mean, that's just square one in that conversation is tough enough. Ross, really nice to talk to you tonight.